We're going to quickly go through some of the key elements that make a successful essay. And this is an essay designed for postgraduate study, but it also resonates and reflects with things that people do at undergraduate level. It is not a question that is coming from a particular course or something that is related to your personal avenue for study, but it is something more generic that can appeal to different audiences at different times. That's why you may notice that the referencing style is different from the one that you used to at this institution, at the institution that you're currently in, or what you're doing later on. But the core ideas are there, and the core concepts as to how to effectively structure an essay are there. These are the sort of questions that we normally get. The question that I chose for this sample says something like, the multinational corporations present a significant challenge for national tax authorities. And you're asked the thing that everybody is usually asked, how to critically analyze, critically discuss the problem of taxation and what national authorities could do to address this problem. Now, the substance of it doesn't really matter. We're not here to talk about taxation for today. Our focus for today is structure. So what matters is that this is a standard type question with a common format, and where you have a statement, it's framing the topic, and then it's followed by a specific instruction for you to do something, this something being usually to critically discuss. The reason why it says this, as is discussed very often, is that we do not expect a purely descriptive answer where you copy-paste various legislative information or other types of information from the literature and you just present it. It's not a matter of simply telling us what's going on. It's an issue of linking together and presenting different opinions and these different dynamics and areas of disagreement and then moving forward. This is what makes the critical discussion. The instructions for this essay were to produce a piece that is 5,000 words long. Now, a good way to begin an answer in a question of an essay type is to start off by highlighting the importance of the topic and picking out the relevant issues. An essay that signposts clearly what the issues are and how the author will address those issues is an essay that works effectively. In the example that we have here before us, we have a good introduction because this introduction identifies the topics to be discussed, but it also explains the sequence in which the author will explain those topics. Now, there is some scope for improvement because this particular introduction for this example here does not really highlight the importance of the topic, but it does say what it is, what they're looking at, why they're looking at it, and how they're going to go about it. But it could say a couple of sentences more about why this is an important area of study. This also helps to sort of frame the issue, and it offers an opening to the literature that's going to be discussed later. So an introduction is essential. The average appropriate length for an introduction. It needs to be relevant to the size of your overall project. This example we've got here is like 5,000 words long, so clearly an introduction can be a little bit longer. If you were only producing 1,000 words, then you wouldn't be able to have a 500-word introduction. Normally, something that is a paragraph that is perhaps a quarter or a maximum a third of a page long will be suitable for the average essay because you're keen to get into the core content of what you want to discuss. So you don't want to spend ages on introductory material. So this is what the introduction is. And as I said, this was a good piece offering a good introduction with some scope for improvement, but it is effective. Now, one of the first things that the examiner will see and will think about and comment upon reading your essay is how well you're integrating the references into what you're talking about when you jump into the substantive parts of the discussion, and whether these references in fact are respectful of the system that has been adopted. The sample essay that I gave you is built on OSCOLA, which is a law school standard in the majority of law schools. Whatever the system is adopted at the school that you're working in, then you need to go with that system. You need to be mindful that what you were used to before, either in the same institution or in another one, might not be replicated here. So it's important that you read the instructions as to referencing styles and make sure that you produce something that satisfies the requirements of this particular assessment. If this requires a degree of study on your part to familiarize yourselves with the system, that is adopted, then you need to do this. Perhaps the worst problem is not the lack of respecting the system adopted, but is inconsistency. Sometimes students will produce something that was asked to be with footnotes and do it Harvard style, or the other way around. It is a sort of deviation from the rules, and you will get a note in your feedback that says you're not respecting the referencing system adopted, but it will not be fatal for your chances. However, referencing that is inconsistent, half the page is on Harvard, half the page is with footnotes, and the styles are different, and the fonts are different, and everything else. This is a red flag for the examiner, because it suggests that perhaps the person writing this, not only they haven't bothered to check what is the referencing system, but also they spend a great deal of time perhaps copy-pasting from various sources and chucking it straight into their essay. So this is something that you should definitely avoid doing, multiplicity of referencing systems within the same essay. Now, moving along in this essay, when we look at how the author here is actually putting things together, this is strange, to be honest with you, because this is a relatively well-written piece. It is in a narrative form. It doesn't have these sort of lists of bullet points or diagrams on things that deviate from what we traditionally understand to be a law essay. So it is nicely presented in narrative form that conveys the information that is found in the literature. However, it lacks adequate identification of where this information is coming from. So while we've got some areas where we've got a set of conclusions or a set of statements that could be the author's own ideas, we don't really know this. So an examiner, when they come across things that look like they should have a reference, that they've come from someplace else, they will be put on notice that this person is not adequately referencing. And remember that you're not doing this just to express yourself. You're doing this to meet certain learning outcomes. And your engagement with the literature is essential in demonstrating how you meet those learning outcomes. Therefore, you do need to provide a multiplicity of references throughout. This piece, when you go through it, you're going to realize that it is inadequately linked with the references. There are footnotes here and there, but they're thin, they're often repetitive because they link back to the same source. This, for me, means what? It points to an essay that is in the merit band as opposed to a distinction level essay. So the lack of adequate engagement with the literature is a red flag and problem right there. This is something that would park this essay in the middle of the competency scale, even though it's very nicely written. So there are various parts in this essay where information is missing, references are missing. Remember that every time that the source is mentioned, be it an online source, something in hard copy, a report, etc., it needs to be identified by a reference. It's not enough to say the UN report. Which UN report? Right? You need to have a specific reference according to the referencing style adopted, and that needs to be present. But there's a key problem with this essay that is really like a massive difficulty, is the fact that the sources are so dated. Now, why is this? Why is it that most of the references are for things in the 90s? The footnotes contain stuff that are like 20 years old. What's going on here? It could be that the student is working from hard copy resources that they found in their local library or in the university library, and all these hard copy sources are dated. That's why the student has incorporated all this dated material. That is a benign explanation for this. But it could be a sinister explanation, which could be that this is not the student's own work. Remember, your work needs to be up to date and contemporary. If you're discussing the law, we need to know the law as it stands now. Even if you're offering a historical explanation of what the law used to be and what it became, you still need to be able to address how the law is now. So if your essay has been produced by dated sources, you will not be fully meeting the learning outcomes, especially in the area of knowledge and understanding. So you need to go a step further than this and update the sources. I'm not saying that older books and articles and stuff are not of relevance and they're not important, but if you're talking about something that is a dynamic area, and something that has contemporary significance, you're not working on a legal history piece, you're working for a law problem now, then your references need to be up to date. For me, as an examiner, if I saw this, I would be very concerned. I would be thinking it's very likely somebody found this on the web and they've copy-pasted it alongside with all the references, and that's why I don't see anything in here that's from beyond like 2002 or something. You can always mention upcoming changes to the law as well. And that shows an engagement with what's happening out there in reality. It could be that your essay title explicitly asks you to consider changes and evolution in the law. To be honest with you, taxation and the taxation of multinationals is such a dynamic area that I would expect the person who wrote this to engage not only with the historical evolution of the law up until today or the day that they're writing it, but also to reflect on possible changes that are in the making, because there's a lot of discussion on how to amend these things for the future. The key flaw with this essay, I'm going to get to the mark of this essay at the end, but for me, number one problem with this essay is the lack of referencing. Wonderfully written, wonderfully structured, wonderfully articulated, but it's based on a handful of sources. And this does not scream distinction level essay. There is a problem with the information in the references that are there, in the sense that they're not done according to style, and every style will require dates for the use of online sources. Do not forget this. You don't only need the date of the source being published, but you also need the date of access. The reason why we need this for online-based material is because they keep moving around. Every year I update study guides and textbooks and so on that I'm involved in, because all our references to the web have all moved and gone someplace else. That's why it's important when you're including in your referencing or in your bibliography an online source to also put the last access date. This is going to be a requirement in the majority of referencing systems that you see. Do not worry about stylistic issues. This will be determined by the type of school that you are, perhaps will be determined by the preferences of your tutor or your examiner or your module leader. If information has not been communicated to you explicitly asking you to adopt a particular style, then you can use what works for you. In this case here, there were not specific stylistic requirements, so the author of the piece chose to use headings and subheadings. This is perfectly fine. And it actually helps with the signposting and the flow of the information. One of the things that you're going to notice about this essay is that frequently there's quite a bit of text in the footnotes. This is a terrible idea, because in the systems that require footnoting for reference, the footnotes do not count towards the word limit, specifically because they're simply for references. In the same way that in other systems, the bibliography does not count for the word limit. But if you start putting explanatory text in the footnotes or in the place where your bibliography is meant to be, then first of all, it does not look nice and it does not respect the referencing guidelines, but also means that you're going to include those in your word count. So don't think you're clever by sticking text in a footnote, hoping we're not going to count it. It's still going to count towards the total of your essay. For a longer essay, it's useful to offer clear signposting. And what this essay does well is that when it begins a new section, it says, this is what we've seen so far, and this is what we're going to discuss now. This is a great idea because it guides the reader through the essay and expressly mentions the connections between the various sections. It makes the flow of the piece better, and the clear signposting means that the examiner, even if they're a little bit bored or falling asleep when they're reading this, it's going to whack them back into place and keep them focused on what's going on. So in terms of structure and presentation, I think this is a good idea, and it doesn't waste a great deal of the word limit because it's just like a couple of sentences here and there. When it comes to the variety of sources that you're using, and this is something that I've mentioned already, do not use the same source many times. If you find that in the same page, you've got 4 or 5 references and all of them return you to the same source, this is a problem. It suggests that effectively you're just paraphrasing the work of somebody else and sticking it all in there as your explanation. It's very unlikely, if you're always returning to the same reference, that your examiner is going to think that you have effectively, critically analyzed and discussed. Because how can it be a critical analysis of various points of view if everything is coming from the same source? Diversifying and having a multiplicity of sources so you don't always return back to the same source shows that you're engaging with the literature. It speaks to your research skills. I think it's a good idea to push your paper from a middle level up to the higher marks. If you're writing a law piece and you're thinking about whether you should include the statutory information, should you copy text from the statutes, from cases, from legal information, it's usually not necessary to copy text either from statute or from case. You offer the reference, so then your examiner can look them up for themselves. Especially if you're using a legal case as authority for a statement of law, the name of the case normally suffices, or the name of the statutory reference or the treaty reference or whatever it is that you're using. You don't need to copy the text and put it in italics and quotation marks. It is only when something very specific in there is helpful, something that your examiner is unlikely to be able to find easily themselves, or you're using a quote from a judgment where the judge says something that is kind of bang on the point that you're trying to make, that it might be useful for you to put this in quotations. But usually a great deal of quotations in speech marks and stuff like that in there is not a great idea. And stylistically, it doesn't look nice, so I would avoid doing this. If you want to have commentary about contemporary attitudes, political or social trends, be mindful of time defining what you're talking about. Because if you're taking your information from an older text and the text says that something's about to change, but that was 20 years ago, you cannot put in your essay something is about to change, or the government thinks this at the moment, or there is a policy trajectory towards that direction, but actually that policy trajectory is historical because your source is from 15 years ago. So just be mindful when you're going through your material. If there are references to external contemporary developments, consider whether they're still contemporary or whether they are in fact historical. And the way to address this is to say, this is what was happening at the time, and perhaps show how it evolved since then. Certain things that you should avoid are kind of presentational and stylistic weaknesses. For instance, why in this piece there are some references that are all in capital. What does this mean? Does it mean that the person kind of lost the will to live and they were just copy pasting the references from the web and they couldn't actually drop the capitals to lowercase? It suggests sloppiness on your part. Now, we're reaching the conclusion. What is an effective conclusion? And this is a concern that people have in the same way that they're concerned about introductions. Every essay needs to have an introduction with the characteristics that we defined earlier on, but it also needs to conclude with a summary of the information that brings together the various strands of the discussion. This introduction and conclusion must mirror each other. So you have to be careful not to place information in the conclusion that actually contradicts the actual analysis that you had. So you start off with an introduction that says, I'm going to take you through this journey in order to reach an outcome. In your conclusion, you say, I took you through this journey and now this is the outcome. But of course, the outcome needs to reflect the trajectory of your discussion. It is unlikely that your conclusion will contain new information. So it's not very often that you put extra references in your conclusion. I know that this is done in this paper. It's not bad, but I just find it a little bit unusual that new information is introduced in a section that's meant to wrap it up. In terms of the bibliography, I think this is fine. The bibliography is adequate. It's broadly put together according to the citation style, but it's not impressive. I don't think the sources here have been utilized in the best fashion. There's a lot of referencing that is repetitive. Online sources could be represented better. They don't have the date for access. So the whole, of course, there's the fact that the whole bibliography is extremely dated, which, as I said, raises concerns. What is the outcome of all of this? What mark are we going to give this person? Well, I think the essay is overall fine. It represents a good effort, but it has some very significant areas for improvement. And the key problem, you must be thinking, what is the key problem with this essay? The key problem is the lack of sufficient engagement with the literature and the fact that the sources are so dated. So any concerns about plagiarism aside, let's assume that this person was just working from hard copy resources in an old library selection. I think this is a problem. Because I'm a generous man, if I was marking on a traditional academic scale, I would be giving this something in the region of low 60s, like a 64% perhaps. So this is for systems where the top mark you can get is a 70%. Now, some of my colleagues that tend to be tougher than me would probably push it into the lower category, because something in the 60s would be a merit for the majority of universities. Something below 60s is in the pass category. I think most of my colleagues would be minded to put it in the pass. because of the dated resources and the lack of adequate referencing. Now, this is my quick summary of what's happening in this paper and the way that it's been marked, and hopefully it gives you some interesting information. You're welcome to read the paper and the notes that are shared with you specifically to see from the inside how the author actually approaches the issue and how the examiner would approach it when marking it, and reflect a little bit on this process, and then compare this output with the marker's comments, and perhaps with what you are trying to do or what you have done in your essays in the past. And I think this is going to be a useful experience. But clearly remember, as you're going through this, that different people can approach the same question in different ways, look at different literatures, and still come up with a valid conclusion. That's why we're not focusing here in this sample on the substantive content of what the people are talking about. We're focusing more on style, right? And expectations and the attitude of the examiner when faced with this material. Hopefully you find this useful, and thank you for sitting with me through this.